The morning started like any other. Officer Jenna Hale stepped into the precinct with her usual brisk walk, her K9 partner Bear at her side, tongue lolling, tail swaying low and steady. They had just wrapped a night shift that ended in a clean takedown. Drugs off the street, a suspect in cuffs, and another feather in the cap of the department's top K9 unit. Bear had been flawless, like always, focused, disciplined, relentless when it counted. That was their rhythm. That was their bond. But today, something was different. The second Jenna walked through the double doors, she felt it. The air was off. Stares lingered too long. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. She barely had time to unclip Bear's harness when Captain Riggs called her into his office. The tone was sharp, final. "Leave the dog," he said. She blinked, taken aback. "Sir." Bear stays outside. Bear, ever alert, let out a quiet whine, shifting his weight toward her leg. Riggs didn't repeat himself. Jenna held Bear's gaze for a moment, then gave the reluctant command to stay. She stepped into the office alone, her spine stiff with unease. Captain Riggs sat behind his desk, jaw tight, hands folded over a manila folder. He didn't ask her to sit. He didn't offer coffee. He just opened the file and read, without looking up. As of this morning, K9 Officer Bear is officially removed from active duty. Jenna's breath caught in her chest. What? It's been decided he's unfit for continued service. Unfit? Her voice cracked with disbelief. Based on what? He passed every physical, every obedience recall. He's been commended twice this quarter. Where is this coming from? Riggs didn't flinch. Internal review. Concerns were raised about his behavior in the field. What concerns? He didn't answer. Jenna stepped forward, hands clenched into fists. Sir, Bear has been my partner for 4 years. He's never had a mark against him. He's never failed a command. He's never even so much as snapped at a civilian. This doesn't make sense. Riggs looked up then. His eyes were flat. This decision is final, Officer Hale. He'll be transferred to holding this afternoon. You're being reassigned to desk duty until we decide the next step. Desk duty. Jenna staggered back like she'd been hit. She turned and walked out without another word, the door slamming behind her. Bear stood where she left him, tail twitching, head cocked in confusion. When she reached him, he pressed his head into her stomach, sensing her tension. She buried a hand in his fur, jaw tight. They didn't even let her take him home. 2 uniformed officers approached less than an hour later with transport orders. Bear, trusting, followed her command to heel, walking with him into the back kennel room like it was just another drill. He didn't know they were separating him from the only handler he'd ever had. Jenna watched the metal door shut behind him. No explanation. No hearing. Just like that, he was gone. The whispers started immediately. Some said Bear had bitten a fellow officer, unprovoked. Others said he'd lost his nerve during a bust and nearly cost someone their life. But none of it added up. Jenna knew Bear, knew his rhythms, his instincts. He didn't flinch in chaos. He didn't lash out. He didn't forget. She tried to fight it, filed appeals, sent emails, asked for meetings. Every request came back denied. Closed. Bear was off the force. And no one, not even her closest allies, would tell her why. That night, Jenna sat in her apartment, staring at Bear's empty crate. The food bowl untouched, leash still looped by the door. Her phone buzzed with messages of sympathy that felt hollow. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a warning. And deep down, Jenna knew something was wrong. Not with Bear, but with the people who wanted him gone. The next morning, Jenna arrived early. Earlier than anyone else. The hallway lights still buzzed with that flicker they had before full power settled in. She didn't stop to grab coffee or exchange nods with the overnight crew. She moved straight to the K9 wing, her boots echoing with clipped purpose on the linoleum. The door to the holding kennels creaked as she pushed through, and then there he was, Bear. He was sitting, stiff and silent behind the gate. His ears perked as soon as he saw her, but he didn't whine. He didn't bark. He just stared, unmoving, like he didn't understand what was happening. like he was waiting for this to all be over so they could go back to work. "Hey, partner," she said softly. He rose and stepped toward the bars, his nose pushing against the wire mesh. Jenna crouched down, slipping her fingers through the gap, letting him sniff, letting him know she was still here, still fighting. His fur was clean, his posture alert, but there was something in his eyes, confusion, that slight tilt of the head that said, he didn't get it either. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "You know that, right?" The silence between them was heavier than any bark. Bear's tail gave a single thump against the ground before settling. She stayed there for a long time, hand resting on the mesh, eyes locked with the dog who had stood beside her through ambushes, raids, gunfire, and silence. He had never failed her, and she wouldn't fail him now. But when she stood up and left the kennel, things didn't get easier. Captain Riggs was unavailable. Again, Lieutenant Sanders, the interim K9 supervisor, avoided eye contact and gave her the same line he had the day before. "It's above my pay grade, Jenna." Above his pay grade. Above hers. Just high enough to make sure nobody had to explain why a decorated K9 officer was being thrown into the shadows like expired equipment. She pressed harder, demanded access to the review files, to the footage from Bear's last training session. Anything that could justify what was happening. But the requests hit a wall. Every door she knocked on was locked. Every face she confronted wore the same empty expression of forced neutrality. Colleagues she'd worked with for years, officers she'd pulled from danger, even the ones who had once called Bear a hero, they looked through her now like she was made of glass. Rumors filled the vacuum. People whispered in break rooms, typed messages they deleted before hitting send. She caught fragments in the hallway. He snapped during a drill, I heard. No warning. Just lunged. They say the recruit needed stitches. I always thought that dog was a little too intense, you know? It was a lie. All of it. There had been no incident. No recruit. No medical reports filed. She would have known. She should have known. But the rumor was doing its job. It was sticking. That night. Jenna sat in her car in the station's back lot, staring up at the darkened windows of the kennel wing. She imagined Bear up there, lying on cold concrete, wondering where she'd gone, why no one was talking to him, why everything had gone silent. She clenched the steering wheel so hard her knuckles cracked. It wasn't just the injustice that burned. It was the betrayal, the slow, deliberate way they were unraveling everything she and Bear had built, without saying a word. Someone was covering something, and they were using Bear to do it. The next morning, she tried again. Riggs wasn't in. Sanders gave her a paper to sign, authorization for reassignment, to finalize Bear's removal from her unit. She didn't sign. Instead, she tore the form in half and tossed it in the trash. If they thought this was over, they didn't know her. Not even close. The precinct was dead quiet after midnight. Just a faint hum of vending machines and the occasional squeak of old pipes rattling in the walls. Jenna had waited in her car for hours, lights off, hood pulled low, pretending not to be herself. When the last of the swing shift disappeared and the janitor's keys stopped jingling down the hall, she slipped in through the side entrance with a badge she technically wasn't supposed to use anymore. Her heart thudded like it used before raids. Fast, steady, sharp, she told herself she was just visiting her partner, checking on him. That's all. But in her gut, something else stirred, a feeling she hadn't been able to shake since the moment Bear was taken from her. The same feeling she got when a suspect's story didn't quite add up, or when a house looked too perfect before a bust. Something was off. She walked quietly down the darkened hallway, her boots careful against the tile. The key card still worked on the K9 wing. Nobody had gotten around to disabling it yet. The door gave a soft click, and she pushed it open, holding her breath as if the walls could hear. The kennels were dim. Low lights hummed from the corners, casting long shadows. Bear's enclosure sat near the end, second from the back, just where they'd put him after the so-called reassignment. He was awake. Not just awake. On edge. His body was rigid, head low, ears pinned and twitching. His paws scratched at the far corner of the concrete wall. Slow and methodical, the way he used a paw at buried narcotics or when he scented explosives sealed in containers. He wasn't growling. He wasn't barking. He was alert, working. "Bear!" Jenna whispered. He turned immediately, ears flicking toward her voice, tail giving a single hesitant wag. She stepped up to the cage, knelt, and slid her hand through the bars. He didn't lick it or nuzzle in like he used to, but he leaned into her palm just enough to let her know he still remembered, still trusted. But after a moment, he turned back to that spot in the wall, nose down, sniffing hard, then pawing again. "What is it?" she whispered, brow furrowing. She watched closely now, trained eyes following every twitch of muscle, every movement. He wasn't being restless. He wasn't stressed. He was alerting, just like he used to when he found hidden compartments. Just like the time he caught wind of a duffel bag stuffed with heroin that 2 trained agents missed. It was the same stance, same motion. Deliberate, certain. Jenna stood slowly and walked to the far side of the cage. She looked at the concrete block. He kept pawing. It was just a wall. Seamless. Smooth. But Bear's nose was glued to the same point, his breath short and focused. She ran her hand over the surface. It felt normal, cold, but then near the bottom, there was a faint shift in texture, just barely, like someone had patched a small section, then painted over it. Jenna's heart climbed into her throat. She stepped back and looked down at Bear. He sat now, eyes locked on the wall, as if waiting for her to catch up. "Okay," she whispered. "I believe you." It was after 2 a.m. when she returned with a small utility knife and a flashlight. She kept it quiet, one ear toward the door, waiting for a footstep or a voice. But no one came. Carefully, she chipped at the painted surface. The concrete flaked, and then something shifted, a hollow sound. She pried the edge loose and pulled. Inside was a cavity no bigger than a shoebox, and inside that, wrapped in a black cloth, was something she never expected to find in a police station. Flash drives, a burner phone, photocopies of signed case files, some of which bore her own name. She pulled one sheet closer to the light. It was a narcotics arrest from 6 months ago, one she'd helped make with Bear. But the numbers didn't add up. The chain of custody had been altered. The signatures were forged. She staggered back, clutching the paper, cold washing over her skin. Someone had been hiding evidence inside the precinct, and Bear had found it. She dropped to her knees beside the cage, her voice shaking. "You weren't agitated," she whispered. "You were doing your job." Bear tilted his head, eyes soft, tail sweeping once across the floor. Jenna rose, wrapping the files and drive in her jacket. Her thoughts raced. Someone had buried this. Someone high up. And someone didn't want Bear sniffing around anymore. Now she knew why they tried to silence him. But they forgot one thing. You don't bury the truth around a K9 without expecting it to dig its way back out. The next morning, Jenna showed up at the precinct in uniform. Clean, sharp, pretending everything was fine. She kept her shoulders back and her tone polite as she made her way past the front desk, offering a tight-lipped smile to the sergeant on duty. She didn't say much, just that she needed to walk Bear, stretch his legs, something to calm him down. No one questioned her. Not yet. Most had already moved on from the fallout. Bear had been labeled a problem, filed away under internal review like a broken asset. The truth was, people forgot fast until they were forced not to. She took the leash from the rack, clipped at the Bear's collar, and opened the gate. He stepped out without hesitation, but his body was different this morning, focused, energized, like he'd been waiting. As soon as they cleared the kennel, he pulled forward, not with panic or aimlessness, but precision. His paws made barely a sound against the tile as he led her down the familiar hallway, past the K9 wing, past the locker rooms, all the way to that same stretch of wall he'd pawed the night before. They stopped. Jenna knelt beside him, heart hammering. Bear didn't whine. He didn't bark. He just sat and stared at the base of the wall, ears perked, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Waiting again, she ran her fingers along the cinder block like before, trying to feel the same subtle difference. And there it was, that shift in texture, barely noticeable to the eye, but rougher to the touch, just off enough that it didn't belong. But this time, she came prepared. She reached into her vest and pulled out a multi-tool, glancing around the hallway. Empty, quiet. She wedged the blade into the seam and pried gently. The panel gave way with a soft pop. It wasn't part of the original wall. Someone had retrofitted a metal panel to blend with the concrete, painted it, patched it, hidden it in plain sight. Behind it was a narrow recess, no bigger than a file drawer, and stuffed inside, wedged together with barely any space between, were documents, folders, plastic bags, some with case numbers scrawled in faded ink, others marked confidential in red stamp. Jenna's fingers trembled as she pulled the first file free. It was shredded sloppily, some pages intact, some torn, names, dates, photos of narcotic seizures, and signatures she recognized, her own, Captain Brill's, even Chief Orton's. She flipped to another file. It was worse. An internal affairs memo, one she remembered being filed but never seeing again, detailing a raid that had mysteriously lost half its evidence during processing. The file had been flagged for review, and then it vanished. Bear let out a soft huff beside her, as if to say, "There. That's what I meant." She swallowed the knot rising in her throat and kept digging. At the very back of the hidden compartment was a sealed evidence bag. Inside, a thumb drive and a typed list of badge numbers. Her stomach turned. These weren't just misplaced documents. This was a graveyard of covered tracks, a place someone had used to bury mistakes too dangerous to live in the light. And someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure Bear wasn't around to sniff it out. Jenna placed the folders gently into her backpack, her hands still trembling, her mind already calculating what would happen next, who she could trust, who she couldn't. She zipped the bag closed, then knelt beside Bear, brushing her hand along his back. "You found it again," she whispered. "You always find it." He pressed his head into her shoulder, quiet and calm now. She didn't cry. Not yet. There wasn't time for that. But something in her shifted as she rose and slid the panel back into place. Something steel and rooted. They tried to make Bear the problem, tried to isolate him, silence him. But what they really feared was what he'd uncover. She walked him out the back exit, taking the long way to avoid questions. The morning sun caught in Bear's fur as they crossed the lot. A breeze stirred the flags overhead. By the time they reached her car, Jenna already knew what she had to do. Not just for Bear, but for every case, every arrest, every life that might have been altered by what had been hidden behind that wall. She opened the back door, and Bear hopped in without hesitation. He didn't know what came next, but he didn't have to, because he trusted her. And more than anything, she trusted him. And now, the truth would finally have its voice. It started with looks, the kind that feel like whispers even when no one speaks. Jenna walked into briefing the next morning, and the room seemed to pivot, just slightly, just enough. Conversation slowed. A few officers didn't meet her eyes. The same men and women who used to clap her on the shoulder after a bust, who laughed with her in the break room, now stared through her like she wasn't even there, like she was a problem no one wanted to touch. She said nothing, just took her seat, hands folded, letting the silence stretch. The lieutenant walked in and gave the rundown for the day. No mention of Bear, no acknowledgement of Jenna's current reassignment. It was like her presence didn't belong to anything anymore. Not a unit, not a team, not even the past. When briefing ended, people filed out quickly, too quickly, except for one. Rookie, nameplate said Morales. New to the precinct by 3 months, maybe 4. Wide eyes. Always took notes like he didn't trust his memory. Jenna hadn't worked a full case with him, but she remembered him asking her questions about Bear after a drug bust a few weeks back. He hung back now, fidgeting with the zipper on his vest. She caught his glance. Didn't push. Just waited. He stepped closer, barely above a whisper. "You didn't hear this from me." Jenna raised an eyebrow, but stayed silent. They'd been talking in the locker room. Not loud, but enough. Stuff about Bear. About why he got pulled. Jenna's jaw tightened. What kind of stuff? Morales looked over his shoulder like the walls might have ears. He found something. That's what they're saying. Not during the call. just during downtime in the station. He hesitated, then leaned in, something he wasn't supposed to smell. Jenna felt her breath hitch, but kept her face still. You know how dogs react when they find something they're trained for, right? Bark, scratch, alert. She nodded slowly. He did that in the admin hallway, near evidence intake, a few days before he was benched. Morales rubbed the back of his neck. Some people say he was reacting to leftover scent. Others say he was targeting something specific. No one really knows. But a day later, they pulled him. Jenna felt the weight of the hidden files in her backpack from the day before, still untouched, still unread in full. She hadn't told anyone yet, hadn't even decided what to do with them. But Bear's behavior matched the timeline. And now she was hearing the whispers, low, careful, filtered through fear, that aligned with everything she already feared. She wanted to ask more, push harder, but Morales was already backing away. "Be careful," he said, eyes darting again. "They're not just pushing him out. They're watching you now, too." Then he was gone. Jenna stood there for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just letting the fear settle. That night she sat at her dining table long after sunset, the documents spread out in front of her. Bear lay near the back door, his head resting on his paws, his gaze flicking to her every few minutes. She'd pulled more files from the stash behind the panel. A few of them had dates that matched old case logs, cases where Bear had made key finds. One involved a drug seizure that had mysteriously been reduced by half between arrest and inventory. Another had 2 conflicting chain-of-custody signatures on a high-level trafficking charge. Both cases had been quietly closed. She leaned back in her chair, eyes burning, heart pounding. Bear didn't just find a scent. He found a trail. And someone had been so afraid of where that trail led, they'd try to erase it. By removing the dog who'd uncovered it. She looked at Bear. He looked back, ears twitching like he was listening even when she hadn't said a word. "I think they want us both gone," she whispered. He blinked, calm, waiting. Jenna stared at the files again, her chest tightening. She'd always trusted her instincts, always trusted her partner. But this wasn't a call-out. This wasn't a bust. This was something rotting at the core, something deeper, dirtier. She reached for her phone, hovering her finger over a contact she hadn't called in months. Internal Affairs. Not because she trusted them, but because they were the only ones with clearance high enough to dig further. If she called, she'd be painting a target on her own back. If she didn't, Bear would take the fall alone. She looked down at him. He didn't wag, didn't move, just watched her. Steady, loyal. "I'm not letting them bury you," she said softly. Then she pressed the call. It was buried in a file no one was supposed to read. Jenna had been granted limited access through a reluctant favor from a former colleague in records, someone who owed her, and who didn't ask questions when she said she was researching old misconduct logs. The report wasn't listed under current investigations. It wasn't even marked as open, just filed away with a quiet tag, resolved internally. It had been filed nearly 2 years ago by a younger officer. A name Jenna recognized, barely. Officer Dylan Pierce. He hadn't lasted long. Left the department suddenly. No public explanation. Just vanished from the roster. At the time, no one had questioned it. People transferred out all the time. But the report he'd filed, it detailed something no one should have been able to walk away from. She sat alone in her apartment, the screen glowing in the dim light, Bear sleeping at her feet. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had shifted. But inside Jenna's world, everything was tilting. According to the complaint, Captain Riggs had interfered in a narcotics investigation, one that involved a warehouse bust and missing kilos. Pierce claimed he'd personally logged the original seizure, marked it, tagged it, uploaded the evidence photos. A week later, half the inventory was gone. When he brought it up to Riggs, he was told there'd been a clerical error. Nothing more. When he pushed again, he was pulled into a meeting and warned, formally, to stop questioning departmental procedure. 2 days after that, he submitted a transfer request. It was denied. The next week, he quit. That complaint never left internal files. Jenna leaned back, heart thudding, It wasn't just speculation anymore. It wasn't a gut feeling. Bear hadn't misread a signal. He'd picked up a scent he remembered, Riggs, in the evidence room, during a time window that now matched the second incident. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She searched the duty logs, cross-referencing the days leading up to Bear's dismissal. Riggs had filed a visit to the evidence room 4 days before Bear's alert. No stated reason. No assigned case. Just a timestamp and his badge number. Officially, it meant nothing. But Jenna remembered Bear's behavior that night. The way he clawed at the panel. The urgency in his movement. K9s didn't act out for no reason. Especially not Bear. His alerts had built careers. Had saved lives. Now she was watching the very instincts he'd been trained to get used as ammunition against him. She looked down at him now. Still sleeping. But his ears twitched every few minutes. Always half alert. That had never changed. It all started to click. Riggs had something to hide. Bear found it. And instead of questioning the alert, instead of checking what had triggered him, they'd turned the narrative. Painted Bear as unstable. Jenna as compromised. And just like that, the best K9 team in the department became a liability. She turned to the final page of the report. A note had been added 6 months later. A different admin signature. Matter closed. Insufficient corroboration. Jenna snorted under her breath. Of course it was. She printed the file. Every page. Highlighted the key portions. Marked the inconsistencies in Riggs's badge log. Then she opened a second file, this one with photos of the stash she and Bear had found behind the wall. It was time to put the pieces together. By morning, she had a case. She brought the file to Internal Affairs. Walked it in herself. No email. No courier. A man named Price met her in the gray-walled office. His expression unreadable. He flipped through the report as she stood silent. You're saying this dog, your K9, sniffed out a trail that connects to a closed internal complaint and a missing narcotics case? I'm not saying anything, Jenna said evenly. I'm showing you what he found. What I found after they tried to bury him. Price studied her a long time, then nodded once. I'll need a copy of everything. You realize this puts you at risk. Jenna glanced down at Bear, who sat at her heel, calm and focused. I've been at risk since the night he barked at that wall. Price didn't smile, but something behind his eyes shifted. Respect, maybe, or a realization. This doesn't go away, he said. Jenna nodded. That's the idea. As she turned to leave, Bear walked in step beside her. No leash, no command, just instinct, loyalty. In her gut, Jenna knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time in weeks, the fear was giving way to fire. And Bear, he was right there with her. The partner they couldn't silence, the dog they'd underestimated. They had tried to erase a truth. But now, that truth had a scent, and Bear was on it. The hallway outside Internal Affairs was quieter than usual. Jenna leaned against the cold cement wall, the printed report still in her hand, its contents heavier than it should have been. Bear sat beside her, his posture alert but calm, the way he always was in moments of tension. He wasn't just a partner, he was an anchor. And right now, she needed that grounding more than ever. Inside, a new investigation was brewing. But out here, the fallout was just beginning. The file she had turned in earlier that week had started unraveling a thread that no one wanted pulled. And now, someone had slipped her something else. An envelope left anonymously in her mailbox at home. No return address, no note. Just a printed set of incident logs, one blurry photo, and a name she hadn't expected to see again. She opened again now, glancing at the grainy image. Bear mid-lunge, teeth bared, eyes locked on a target. At first glance, it was terrifying. But Jenna had trained with him long enough to know better. It was staged. There was no handler in frame. No command cue. No context. Just a snapshot meant to be misinterpreted. And next to the photo, stapled with a report, was the internal citation that had led to Bear's dismissal. Aggression during a controlled training exercise. A civilian witness had allegedly confirmed it. The date matched up. The training session had happened. But Jenna had been off duty that day. She hadn't even known Bear was being put through drills without her. The log showed that the session had been monitored by a higher-ranking officer, Captain Riggs. Her stomach turned. Bear shifted beside her, sensing the change in her breath, in her body. He didn't whine, didn't move, just waited. The report was padded with just enough detail to sound legitimate. Controlled environment, witness feedback, behavior deemed unpredictable, unprovoked. Bear had lunged at a bystander without a clear trigger. The trainer on record? Transferred last month. The witness? No full name, just M. Davis. Jenna had never met a Davis in any training scenario with Bear. She checked the personnel directory. There was no M. Davis. It wasn't just false. It was built, constructed like scaffolding to support a lie. They'd known Bear was getting close to something. Or maybe he already had. Maybe Riggs had caught him sniffing an evidence room, caught him locked in on that stash behind the panel. Maybe he'd seen the way Bear reacted to that unmarked box. The bark, the sudden stance, the digging claws. And instead of asking why, Riggs had decided it was time to erase the question. Bear hadn't failed. He hadn't misbehaved. He'd done exactly what he was trained to do. And that's what scared them. Jenna stood and started walking. Bear followed instantly. The decision had already been made in her head, even before she realized it. If they wanted to silence them, they'd have to work harder. Back at the precinct, Jenna stepped through the side door, keeping her badge low and her voice lower. She knew exactly where she needed to go. She entered the storage room first, the one where training sessions were logged. Inside the old metal file cabinet, bottom drawer, tucked behind years of dust, was a manila folder marked K9 Evaluation, Internal Review. The lock was broken. The drawer creaked open with a groan. She flipped through until she found it. The form submitted for Bear's evaluation that day. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed. Too clean. Too perfect. And the signature? A trainer Jenna recognized, but hadn't spoken to in over a year. She snapped a photo. Then she flipped further. There, stuck behind a divider, was a footage log. Every training session had a camera rolling, always department policy. And next to Bear's session was a red X. Footage loss. Equipment malfunction. Notes typed in after the fact. Convenient. She stared at the timestamp, then looked at the next line. The very next session was recorded with no issues. It wasn't a coincidence. She heard footsteps behind her and turned sharply, but it was just Officer Parnell, one of the newer recruits. He froze when he saw her, then glanced at Bear. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said softly, but without edge. Jenna stared at him. Neither was Riggs. Parnell's eyes flicked to the folder in her hand, then back to the dog. Bear stared up at him, ears slightly raised. Parnell lowered his voice. "Whatever you're doing, just be careful. Not everyone wants that truth to come out." Jenna didn't respond. She just nodded once and stepped past him, Bear tight at her side. They were being watched now, she knew. The wall around the truth was beginning to crack, and with every move Bear made, it was shifting. The falsified report, the missing footage, the made-up witness. It wasn't just about discrediting a dog. It was about stopping what he'd found. But Bear had never stopped for anyone, and neither would she. The knock on Jenna's apartment door came just after midnight. 3 short raps, firm but not aggressive. She opened it to find no one there, just a plain envelope on the floor. No name, no stamp, no seal. She picked it up and closed the door behind her, her pulse already quickening. Inside were 4 photocopied pages. One was a training log, the same kind she dug up from the precinct. But this one had the footage ID code handwritten in the corner, circled twice. Another page was a signed statement. A typed line at the top read, "He told us not to file it." And below, in shaky pen, the name M. Davis. She froze. The last page was a photo. Low-res, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Riggs in the evidence room after hours. He wasn't alone. Another man, face half-turned, box in hand. No badge, no authorization. But the timestamp matched the night Bear had sounded off. It wasn't just confirmation. It was a trigger. Something had started, and someone on the inside had had enough. The next morning, Internal Affairs called, not a suggestion, not a casual request, a direct summons, closed-door meeting, mandatory. She didn't hesitate. But this time, she didn't walk in empty-handed. She arrived with 2 folders and a flash drive, Bear at her side. IA didn't usually allow non-humans in these meetings, but she didn't ask. Bear had earned his place more times than she could count. The room was dim. 3 agents sat at a long metal table, their faces neutral but their eyes sharp. One she recognized, McMillan, the lead on IA reviews. The others were new, fresh faces, federal. She sat down without waiting for instruction and placed the folders on the table. I was dismissed for bringing a motion into protocol, she said, calm but direct. Bear was labeled unfit. I want that label rescinded. McMillan didn't blink. We're here to talk about the anonymous complaint filed yesterday morning. Jenna nodded. Then let's talk. She opened the first folder. This is a falsified report. You'll see the trainer's name was used without their knowledge. That trainer was on leave during the incident. There was no civilian witness. Davis doesn't exist in any official record. She opened the second folder. This is a corrected log. Pulled from archive backups. You'll see the footage ID. The report says the footage was lost due to equipment failure. But this ID tag proves it was recorded and never logged. I had it pulled Jenna plugged in the flash drive. The screen behind them flickered to life. Grainy surveillance footage played. A training yard. Bear standing still. A man holding a tug toy steps forward. Bear lunges, not at the man, but toward a scent. His nose snaps to the side, his body rigid. Not aggression. Detection. The video paused. From the precinct's server cache. It was hidden, buried under a mislabeled directory. One of the agents leaned forward slightly, eyebrows lifting. Look at the target, Jenna said, tapping the screen. There was no command given. No aggressor. Bear was alerting. But the man who staged the exercise filed complaint within the hour. Claimed Bear attacked. And the incident was buried. The next clip played. Security cam. Riggs. Entering the evidence room past midnight. The date matched the seal file log. The one with missing case material. Another man handed him a box, unmarked. They both disappeared off-screen. The screen went black. Silence. McMillan exhaled through his nose. Do you know who sent the tip? Jenna shook her head. No, but I know why they sent it. Someone inside still wants the truth. The federal agent on the right closed the folder slowly. You understand this doesn't end here. If Riggs is involved in evidence tampering, we're looking at federal obstruction. Potential trafficking if that box contained material from seal cases. Jenna's eyes stayed on the dark screen. I know. Bear remained silent at her side, calm but watchful, as if he knew exactly what was at stake. McMillan stood. We'll take it from here. But Jenna didn't move yet. I want his record cleared. I want the dismissal revoked. Publicly. The agent hesitated, then nodded. If this holds, it will be. She stood. Bear rose with her. As she stepped out of the room, the hallway felt different. Not safer, not yet, but sharper, focused. She didn't know who had sent the tip, but they'd cracked the dam wide open. And now that the flood had started, the lies wouldn't hold. The walls they'd built around the truth were crumbling, and Bear had found the first crack. The news came early, barely passed on. A department-wide bulletin hit every inbox, cold, clinical, stripped of ceremony. Effective immediately, Captain J. Riggs is suspended pending further investigation into misconduct involving evidence handling. No details, no names attached. But every officer who read it knew exactly what it meant. Jenna read it twice, not because she didn't believe it, but because belief and reality still hadn't caught up with each other. The man who had stood in every press briefing, who barked orders from behind his tinted office glass, was gone. Not transferred, not quietly reassigned. Suspended. Publicly. She sat in her cruiser for a long moment outside the station, fingers resting on the steering wheel. Bear sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, calm and content, as if the weight in the air no longer pressed against him, as if he could finally breathe. The parking lot was unusually quiet for a weekday morning. Maybe it was the shock, maybe the shift schedules, or maybe people just didn't know how to face her now. The officer who'd stood her ground, the dog they tried to erase. Inside, the silence was thicker. Doors stayed half-closed. Conversations died when she passed. But not everyone looked away. Officer Garrison, one of the few who had remained neutral through it all, gave her a silent nod. A young desk clerk offered a small smile. It wasn't a welcome parade, but it wasn't a cold shoulder either. By mid-afternoon, she was called upstairs, not to a disciplinary board, not to internal affairs, just a simple room with a long wooden table and a single man sitting at the head, Deputy Chief Harmon. He had a file in front of him, thick with forms and signatures. He didn't waste time. "Officer Hale," he said, opening the file, "we concluded our preliminary review of your conduct in the matter involving K9 Unit 382, Bear. Your actions, while unorthodox, were justified in light of the evidence you presented." Jenna said nothing. She didn't need to. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, her posture rigid. "Effective immediately," Harmon continued. "You're cleared of any wrongdoing. Your record will reflect no demotion, no suspension. And Bear," he paused, glancing toward the closed doors that the dog could hear him from down the hall, "is reinstated to active duty, pending his recertification, which should be a formality." Jenna's voice was soft but steady. "And Riggs, formal charges are being filed. Obstruction, falsifying official reports, and evidence suppression. There may be more depending on what the feds turn up." He leaned back slightly. "You were right. And if not for your persistence and that dog, we'd still be blind." She nodded once, rising to her feet. "Thank you, sir." He didn't stop her as she turned to leave. "Officer Hale," he said after a beat, "I know what this place put you through. I won't pretend it didn't happen, but I hope you'll stay." She paused at the door, then looked back. "I didn't come back for the precinct. I came back for my partner." The next day, the station hosted a photo op. Not a full-blown ceremony. Too soon for that. But something real. Officers lined the front steps in dress blues. A few held signs. Someone had printed a banner. "Welcome back, Bear." It wasn't for headlines. It wasn't about face-saving. It was a moment, a rare one. Bear stood proudly at Jenna's side, harness freshly clean, badge polished. The same dog they had tried to label dangerous, unfit, a liability. Camera shutters snapped as Bear lifted his head and posed like he'd done 100 times before. Jenna knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. A reporter shouted from behind the barrier, "Officer Hale, any comment on Bear's reinstatement?" She smiled, not for the cameras, but for the dog who had stood beside her through every moment of silence and doubt. "He never stopped doing his job," she said. "They just stopped listening." And when the photos were done and the banner came down, Bear climbed back into the passenger seat of their cruiser like nothing had changed, except everything had. The station didn't just get AK-9 back. It got its integrity back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the precinct steps as Jenna Hale walked through the glass doors, her hand resting lightly on the harness of the dog at her side. The air outside felt different, less like the way of the storm about to break, and more like the clearing afterward. Wet earth, broken clouds, and silence that didn't sting. Bear walked close, every step in sync with hers, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the calm confidence of a soldier returning home. There were no reporters, no clapping hands, no broadcast vans parked at the curb. That had all happened yesterday, when the department needed to show its redemption in photographs. Today was quiet, honest, and Jenna preferred it that way. Her boots hit the pavement with a steadiness that had taken months to reclaim. When she looked down at Bear, there was no leash between them, just trust. He trotted slightly ahead before glancing back at her, tail low and easy, like he understood this wasn't a patrol. It was a moment. As they reached the sidewalk, Jenna stopped and turned to look back at the building. The same walls that once tried to swallow them whole. the same badge she had almost walked away from. She remembered standing in the same spot just weeks ago, bear-locked a kennel, her career dangling from a lie and silence curling around her like a noose. Bear sat beside her now, calm and grounded. He didn't speak. He never had. But in every tilt of his head, in every measured step, he had been saying something all along. And now, Jenna could finally hear it. He had known. The night they'd pulled him off duty, he hadn't barked. He hadn't fought. But his eyes had searched hers with the same quiet insistence they'd always shared on stakeouts, raids, search calls. He hadn't needed to say it. Something was wrong. And when the world stopped listening, Bear never stopped noticing. She thought back to that first night in the holding kennel, how his nose had twitched, how his paws scratched at the same section of wall over and over, even when she couldn't see what he saw. And later, how that wall had broken open, along with everything they thought they knew about the people running the precinct. Bear hadn't just been sniffing out drugs or danger. He had been sniffing out the lie. Jenna ran her fingers down his back now, just behind his ears, feeling the rise and fall of his steady breath. She wasn't sure who had saved who. She brought Bear into the field, trained with him, stood by his side during arrests and high-speed chases. But when everything fell apart, when the whispers turned to reports and the reports turned to a trap, it was Bear who kept digging, and Bear who led her out. They started walking again, away from the station, toward the park where she used to train him off-duty. Their old path. People passed them, not knowing the story, not knowing how close the truth had come to being buried forever. At the edge of the park, Bear paused. Jenna stopped beside him, watching as he sniffed the air, then sat. Same spot where she used to throw the tennis ball, where he used the barrel after it with impossible speed, like his life depended on it. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a faded old tennis ball. She hadn't brought it for training. She just needed it with her. Something familiar. She tossed it gently, barely 10 feet away. Bear watched it land in the grass. He didn't chase it. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked to it, nudged it with his snout, and looked back at her. Jenna smiled. "You knew," she whispered, her throat tight. "You always did." And in the quiet that followed, with the city stretching out behind them, and the truth finally uncovered, Jenna Hale knew something else too. They weren't just officer and K9. They weren't just survivors of corruption or victims of betrayal. They were partners. And some partners don't need to speak to be heard. Some just stand their ground, nose to the wind, ears alert, and heart locked on the truth until the world catches up. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button. Stories like Bear's deserve to be heard.